Lieutenant Colonel Morgan Bennett stood in the pre-dawn darkness of Fort Braxton, watching 500 enemy combatants through night vision scopes as they surrounded her isolated outpost. In 6 hours, she would be leading the most unlikely military victory in modern warfare history. But 18 months earlier, her own commanders had told her she would never be fit to lead soldiers in combat. This is the story of how one woman's refusal to accept no changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Tactical Operations Center at Fort Braxton as Captain Morgan Bennett hunched over a stack of logistics reports, her coffee growing cold beside a computer monitor filled with supply requisitions. At 29, she possessed one of the most brilliant tactical minds the Army had ever produced. With a master's degree in military strategy from West Point and expertise in asymmetric warfare that had earned her recognition from Pentagon think tanks. Not that any of it mattered in her current assignment. "Bennett, where's the ammunition inventory for Bravo Company?" barked Major Dennis Crawford, striding across the administrative office with his characteristic swagger. Crawford had made it abundantly clear from day one that he considered Morgan's assignment to his logistics division a waste of everyone's time, especially his own. "On your desk since 0700, sir," Sarah replied evenly, not looking up from her paperwork. She'd learned over the past year and a half to keep her responses brief and professional. Engaging with Crawford's barely concealed hostility only made things worse. Crawford picked up the report from his desk, scanning it with exaggerated scrutiny. "These numbers better be accurate, Captain. I don't have time to clean up mistakes from officers who should be teaching kindergarten instead of playing soldier." The comment stung, as it was meant to. Morgan had heard variations of it countless times since her reassignment. She bit back the response that rose in her throat, something about her tactical innovations that had saved lives in 3 different theaters of operation, and simply nodded. "All verified, sir." From across the office, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez watched the exchange with barely concealed disgust. Rodriguez was one of the few people at Fort Braxton who treated Morgan with genuine respect, having served under her briefly before the reassignment that had derailed Morgan's career. The sergeant's expression suggested she was fighting the same urge to respond that Morgan was suppressing. "You know, Bennett," Crawford continued, his voice taking on that particular tone of condescension that had become all too familiar. "Maybe if you spent less time playing strategic mastermind and more time focusing on actual military fundamentals, you might have avoided whatever screw-up got you transferred to my department." Morgan's hand stilled on her keyboard. The screw-up. Crawford was referring to his Operation Desert Shield, a classified mission where Morgan had questioned orders that would have resulted in civilian casualties. Her tactical assessment had been proven correct 3 months later when intelligence confirmed the targets were a school and hospital. But by then, her career had already been effectively ended by a review board that valued compliance over competence. "I'll keep that in mind, sir," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Crawford snorted and walked away, probably heading to the officers' club where he spent most afternoons, complaining about the decline of military standards to anyone who would listen. Sarah returned to her computer, pulling up requisition forms for medical supplies, trying to push down the familiar frustration that threatened to overwhelm her. The irony wasn't lost on her. Fort Braxton was home to the 75th Ranger Regiment, some of the most elite soldiers in the American military. Every day, she watched real warriors train for real missions while she calculated how many MREs they'd need for field exercises. It was like being a Formula One driver assigned to check tire pressure in the pit crew. "Ma'am," Sergeant Rodriguez said quietly, approaching Sarah's desk when Crawford was safely out of earshot. "Intelligence briefing in conference room B thought. You might want to know." Sarah looked up, puzzled. "I'm not on the distribution list for intelligence briefings, Rodriguez." "No, ma'am, but Rodriguez glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Word is there's unusual activity in Sector 12. Multiple sources reporting coordinated movement. Thought someone with your background might find it interesting." Sarah felt a familiar spark of interest. Sector 12 was a mountainous region about 40 miles from Fort Braxton, known for difficult terrain and limited access routes. If enemy forces were operating there, it suggested a level of planning and organization that went beyond typical insurgent activity. "Thanks for the heads up," Sarah said, already calculating whether she could slip away from her desk long enough to listen in on the briefing. 20 minutes later, Sarah stood in the back of Conference Room B, having convinced the guard that she needed to verify supply requirements for any potential operations. The room was filled with the usual suspects: company commanders, intelligence officers, operations staff. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the battalion commander, stood at the front beside a large tactical display. "Intelligence confirms at least 200 hostiles moving through the mountain passes," Harrison was saying, his pointer tracing routes on the digital map. "They're well-equipped, well-organized, and they're heading directly toward our sector." Sarah studied the display intently, her strategic training automatically analyzing the enemy's likely objectives and routes of approach. Something about the pattern bothered her, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what. Captain Derek Walsh, one of the company commanders, raised his hand. "Sir, what's their probable target? Are we looking at a direct assault on the base?" "That's what we're trying to determine," Harrison replied. "Their current trajectory suggests they might be planning to establish a staging area in the foothills, possibly for future operations against regional targets." Sarah frowned, studying the map more carefully. The enemy's movement pattern didn't match the objectives Harrison was describing. If anything, it looked like, "Excuse me, sir," she found herself saying before she could think better of it. Heh. Intelligence considered that this might be a coordinated pincer movement designed to isolate forward units during training exercises. The room fell silent. Harrison's eyes found her in the back, his expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "Captain Mitchell, what are you doing in this briefing?" "Verifying supply requirements for potential operations, sir," Sarah replied, her heart racing. She'd done it again, spoken up when she should have stayed quiet, offered analysis when nobody had asked for it. "Well, since you're here," Harrison said, his tone making it clear he wasn't pleased, "perhaps you'd like to explain your assessment to the actual combat commanders in this room." Sarah stepped forward, pointing to the tactical display. "Sir, if you look at the timing and routes, they're not moving to establish a staging area. They're positioning themselves to cut off retreat routes from Training Area Charlie, where Alpha Company is conducting their certification exercise this week." Captain Walsh looked skeptical. "That's a pretty big assumption, Captain. How do you figure?" "The terrain analysis supports it," Sarah continued, warming to her subject despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere in the room. Training Area Charlie has 3 primary exit routes. The enemy's positioning would allow them to control all 3 with minimal force deployment. It's a classic isolation strategy: cut off a smaller unit, overwhelm them with superior numbers, then use the captured equipment and position to launch a larger assault. Harrison studied the map for a moment, his expression unreadable. "That's an interesting theory, Captain. Unfortunately, we don't have time for theoretical discussions. We need concrete operational plans based on confirmed intelligence." "But, sir, if I'm right about their intentions, Captain Mitchell," Harrison cut her off sharply, "your job is supply logistics, not tactical analysis. I suggest you return to your actual duties and leave combat planning to qualified officers." The dismissal hit Sarah like a physical blow. Qualified officers. The implication was clear: she wasn't qualified, despite her advanced training, her proven track record, her expertise in exactly this type of asymmetric warfare scenario. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, moving toward the door. As she left the conference room, Sarah heard Captain Walsh's voice. "Sir, should we at least verify Captain Mitchell's assessment? If there's any chance she's right about the pincer movement." "Walsh," Harrison's voice was firm, "we have confirmed intelligence and standard operational procedures to follow. I'm not going to alter mission planning based on speculation from a logistics officer." Sarah walked back to her desk in the administrative office, her mind racing. Everything about the enemy's movement pattern suggested a sophisticated tactical approach. This wasn't random insurgent activity, it was a coordinated operation planned by someone who understood American military procedures and training schedules. She pulled up the training calendar on her computer, cross-referencing it with the intelligence reports she'd overheard. Alpha Company was scheduled to complete their final certification exercise tomorrow, a 48-hour field training exercise in Training Area Charlie. 60 soldiers, mostly young Rangers completing their advanced tactical training, would be isolated in difficult terrain with limited communication and evacuation options. If her assessment was correct, they were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. Sarah stared at her computer screen, weighing her options. She could try to approach Harrison again, but he'd already made it clear that her input wasn't welcome. She could go through Crawford, but that was even less likely to succeed. Her immediate supervisor barely tolerated her presence, much less her strategic insights. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. Sergeant Rodriguez was walking toward her desk, her expression troubled. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said quietly, "overheard some interesting chatter from the training coordinators. Alpha Company's exercise got moved up. They're deploying to Training Area Charlie tonight instead of tomorrow morning." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. If the enemy was indeed planning to trap Alpha Company, moving up the timeline would put the Rangers in position earlier than expected, potentially right into the middle of an enemy force that might not be fully positioned yet. "Rodriguez," Sarah said carefully, "what's your assessment of Alpha Company's readiness level?" "Honestly, ma'am, they're good soldiers, but it's mostly green troops on their first major field exercise. Lieutenant Carter is leading them. Solid officer, but limited combat experience. If they run into serious trouble..." Rodriguez didn't need to finish the sentence. 60 young Rangers, led by an inexperienced officer, trapped in difficult terrain against a numerically superior enemy force with the advantage of preparation and positioning. It would be a massacre. Sarah looked back at her computer screen, at the endless stream of supply requisitions and administrative tasks that had become her world. 18 months ago, she would have been leading that training exercise, or at least involved in the operational planning. Now she was counting ammunition and filing reports while soldiers she could have protected walked into a trap. But what could she do? She was Captain Mitchell, logistics officer, the woman who wasn't qualified to lead, who didn't have the temperament for command, who asked too many uncomfortable questions and couldn't be trusted with real responsibility. The problem was, she was also the only person who had correctly analyzed the enemy's strategy. And in 6 hours, 60 American soldiers were going to pay the price for her superior's refusal to listen. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The clock on Morgan's computer screen read 1847 hours. When she made the decision that would either save 60 lives or end her military career permanently. She had spent the last 3 hours watching intelligence updates trickle in, each one confirming her worst fears about the enemy's true intentions. "Rodriguez," she called softly to the sergeant who was finishing her own paperwork across the office. "I need you to listen to something, and I need your honest assessment." Rodriguez approached, her expression curious but cautious. Morgan had pulled up a detailed topographical map of Training Area Charlie on her secondary monitor, overlaying it with the latest enemy position reports. "Look at this movement pattern," Morgan said. tracing the enemy positions with her finger. "They've established observation posts here, here, and here." She pointed to 3 elevated positions that dominated the main access routes. "Supply caches positioned along these ridgelines. Mobile units moving in coordinated sweeps that will converge right here." Her finger landed on the center of training area Charlie. Rodriguez studied the display, her expression growing increasingly grim. "Ma'am, that's not random movement. That's a textbook encirclement operation." "Exactly. And Alpha Company deploys to the center of that kill zone in less than 4 hours. Morgan leaned back in her chair, running her hands through her hair. "Rodriguez, what would you do if you were in my position?" The sergeant was quiet for a long moment, understanding the weight of the question. "Ma'am, with respect, that's not my decision to make. But if it were ... double quotes, she paused, looking at the tactical display again. "Those are good soldiers walking into a meat grinder. Someone needs to speak up. I already tried. Harrison shut me down." "Completely. Then go higher." Morgan laughed bitterly. "Higher?" "Rodriguez, I'm a disgraced logistics officer who questions orders and can't be trusted with real responsibility, remember? Who exactly am I supposed to call? The Pentagon? The Joint Chiefs? What about Colonel Martinez?" Rodriguez suggested. Martinez was the regimental commander, Harrison's superior. He's got a reputation for listening to his officers. Martinez is at the War College Symposium in Carlisle. Won't be back until tomorrow afternoon. Morgan had already checked. By then, Alpha Company will either be extracted safely or... She didn't finish the sentence. Both women knew what the alternative was. Morgan stared at the tactical display, her mind racing through possibilities. Every conventional channel had been exhausted. The chain of command had spoken. But conventional channels hadn't gotten them into this mess conventional thinking had. "Rodriguez, what do you know about Lieutenant Carter?" "Alpha Company's commander? Good officer, takes care of his troops. Maybe a little too by the book, but that's not necessarily bad for someone his age." Rodriguez paused. "Why?" "Because if we can't stop this through official channels, maybe we can warn them directly." Rodriguez's eyes widened. "Ma'am, that would be going around the entire command structure. You could face court-martial charges. As opposed to what? Sitting here filling out requisition forms while 60 soldiers die because I was too much of a coward to act on intelligence I know is accurate." The weight of the decision settled on Morgan's shoulders like a physical burden. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed to build her military career, would be destroyed if she was wrong. But if she was right and did nothing, the consequences would be far worse than her own ruination. "I need to make a call," Morgan said finally. She walked to the secure communication station in the corner of the office, the one used for coordinating with field units during training exercises. Technically, she had access to it for logistics coordination. Technically, she was authorized to contact Alpha Company about supply matters. This definitely wasn't about supplies. Morgan picked up the handset and dialed the frequency for Alpha Company's command post. After several minutes of static and connection attempts, a young voice crackled through the speaker. "Alpha Company, this is Corporal Stevens." "Corporal Stevens, this is Captain Bennett, Fort Braxton Logistics Coordination. I need to speak with Lieutenant Carter immediately. It's urgent." "Ma'am, the lieutenant is in final briefing with the squad leaders. We're deploying in 3 hours. Can this wait until..." "Corporal, this cannot wait. Get Lieutenant Carter on this radio right now." Something in Morgan's tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, because Stevens responded immediately. "Yes, ma'am, stand by." 2 minutes later, a different voice came through the speaker. "This is Lieutenant Carter." "Captain Bennett, what's the nature of your urgent logistics issue?" Morgan took a deep breath. This was it, the point of no return. "Lieutenant, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and I need you to trust me completely. Your training exercise tomorrow is compromised. You're being deployed directly into an enemy ambush. The silence on the other end of the radio stretched for nearly 10 seconds. When Carter finally responded, his voice was carefully controlled. "Captain, I'm not sure I understand. Our mission briefing didn't indicate any hostile presence in Training Area Charlie. That's because the intelligence assessment was incomplete. Lieutenant, I've analyzed the enemy movement patterns from the last 24 hours. They're not establishing a staging area, they're setting up a kill zone. Your deployment area is the center of a coordinated encirclement operation." Another pause. "Captain Bennett, with all due respect, logistics officers don't typically conduct tactical analysis of enemy movements." Morgan closed her eyes. Even Carter, who had never met her, had absorbed the institutional bias that dismissed her expertise. "Lieutenant, my background is in asymmetric warfare strategy. I have 3 deployments worth of experience analyzing exactly this type of enemy operation. What I'm telling you is based on solid tactical analysis, not speculation. But surely, if there was a genuine threat, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison would have—" "Harrison dismay assessment without consideration," Morgan interrupted. "He believes the enemy is establishing a staging area for future operations. He's wrong, and if Alpha Company deploys as scheduled, you're going to walk into a trap that will cost lives." She could hear voices in the background on Carter's end, probably his squad leaders wondering why their final briefing had been interrupted by a random logistics officer making wild claims about enemy ambushes. "Captain Bennett," Carter said finally, "I appreciate your concern, but I can't make operational decisions based on unofficial intelligence assessments. If you believe there's a genuine threat, you need to go through proper channels." "I tried." "Proper channels, they failed," Morgan's voice hardened. "Lieutenant, in 2 hours, your soldiers are going to be isolated in difficult terrain with limited communication and extraction options. The enemy has positioned observation posts to monitor all primary exit routes and mobile units positioned for a coordinated assault. This is not a training exercise anymore, it's a combat operation, and your troops aren't prepared for it." The radio crackled with static. When Carter spoke again, his voice had changed subtly. "Captain, assuming for a moment that your assessment is accurate, what would you recommend?" Morgan felt a surge of hope. He was listening, actually listening instead of dismissing her outright. "First, delay deployment by at least 12 hours while proper reconnaissance confirms enemy positions. Second, if deployment must proceed as scheduled, alter your route to avoid the main access roads where they've established observation posts. Third, request immediate support from battalion to clear your exit routes before you're in position." "Captain Bennett, I don't have authority to delay deployment or request additional support without going through Lieutenant Colonel Harrison." "Then go through Harrison. With what justification?" "An unofficial tactical assessment from a logistics officer who contacted me outside proper channels." Morgan understood the impossible position she was putting Carter in. As a young officer, any deviation from standard procedures could destroy his career just as thoroughly as it would destroy hers. But the alternative was unthinkable. "Lieutenant, how long have you been with Alpha Company?" 8 months, ma'am." "And how many of your soldiers are on their first deployment?" A pause. "Approximately 40%, ma'am." "So you've got 24 soldiers who have never been in real combat, about to be deployed into a situation where they'll be outnumbered 8-1 by experienced enemy fighters who have had days to prepare positions and plan their assault." The weight of those numbers settled over the radio conversation like a shroud. Carter was quiet for nearly a minute before responding. "Captain Bennett, if I were to approach Lieutenant Colonel Harrison with your assessment, what evidence could I provide to support the request for delayed deployment?" Morgan felt her heart racing. Carter was considering it. actually considering challenging his superiors based on her analysis. I can provide you with detailed intelligence summaries showing enemy movement patterns, tactical analysis of their positioning strategy, and terrain assessments that demonstrate why Training Area Charlie is tactically indefensible against the force they've assembled. And you're willing to attach your name to this assessment? That was the question Morgan had been dreading. Putting her name on an official challenge to Harrison's operational planning would be career suicide. There would be no recovering from openly contradicting a lieutenant colonel's intelligence assessment, especially when her own credibility was already damaged. But 60 soldiers were counting on someone making the right decision, even if they didn't know it yet. Yes, Lieutenant. I'll attach my name and stake my career on this assessment. Rodriguez, who had been listening to the entire conversation, gave Morgan a look of mingled admiration and concern. They both knew what this decision meant. All right, Captain Bennett. Give me 30 minutes to review your intelligence summaries and prepare a presentation for Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. If your analysis is as solid as you believe it is, I'll request an immediate meeting to discuss altering our deployment schedule. Lieutenant, Morgan said, one more thing. When you approach Harrison, emphasize that this is your request based on your own tactical concerns. Don't lead with my involvement. Let him focus on the intelligence rather than the source. Understood, ma'am. I'll contact you within the hour with Harrison's response. The radio went silent, leaving Morgan and Rodriguez alone in the administrative office with the weight of what had just transpired. Morgan slumped back in her chair, suddenly feeling the full impact of exhaustion and stress. Ma'am, Rodriguez said quietly, that took guts. That took desperation, Morgan corrected. Rodriguez, if I'm wrong about this, if the enemy isn't planning what I think they're planning, I've just destroyed not only my own career, but potentially Carter's as well. And if you're right and had done nothing? Morgan nodded, understanding the sergeant's point. Sometimes there were no good choices, only necessary ones. They waited. Morgan tried to focus on her regular duties, but found herself staring at the tactical display every few minutes, second-guessing her analysis, wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her professional life. 47 minutes later, the secure radio crackled to life. Captain Bennett, this is Lieutenant Carter. Morgan grabbed the handset immediately. Go ahead, Lieutenant. Ma'am, I presented your intelligence assessment to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison as my own tactical concerns about the deployment. Morgan held her breath. He rejected the request for delayed deployment. He's convinced the enemy is establishing a staging area and poses no immediate threat to Alpha Company's training exercise. Morgan felt her heart sink. What about the tactical analysis? The positioning patterns? He dismissed them as irrelevant to our mission parameters. Alpha Company deploys as scheduled in 90 minutes. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of failure and the approaching catastrophe that neither of them could prevent through official channels. Captain Bennett, Carter said finally, I want you to know that I believe your assessment is accurate. My tactical training supports your conclusions about enemy positioning and intent. But you can't act on that belief. Not through official channels, no ma'am. The implication hung in the air between them. Carter was telling her something without saying it directly, something that could only be communicated through careful subtext and shared understanding of impossible situations. Lieutenant, Morgan said slowly, what's your assessment of Alpha Company's communication capabilities once you're deployed? Standard field radios, ma'am. Effective range of approximately 8 miles in ideal conditions, probably less given the mountainous terrain. And your contingency plans if you encounter unexpected hostile contact? Standard extraction procedures. Request immediate support from battalion, establish defensive positions, attempt to reach designated rally points for evacuation. What if your communication systems are compromised and you can't request support? Another pause. That would be problematic, ma'am. Morgan stared at the tactical display, her mind racing through possibilities. Alpha Company was going to deploy regardless of her warnings. Harrison wasn't going to change his assessment regardless of the evidence. But that didn't mean 60 soldiers had to die because of institutional stubbornness. "Lieutenant Carter," she said carefully, "what's your opinion of unsolicited tactical support from qualified personnel who might be monitoring training exercises for logistics coordination purposes?" This time the pause was longer, and when Carter responded, his voice carried a note of understanding. "Ma'am, any qualified support would be welcomed in a genuine emergency situation, regardless of the source." Morgan looked at Rodriguez, who had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement. The sergeant nodded slightly, understanding what Morgan was considering. "Lieutenant, maintain radio contact on this frequency once you're deployed. If logistics coordination becomes necessary for any reason, this channel will be monitored." "Understood." "MAAM. Alpha Company will maintain communication protocols throughout the training exercise." The radio went silent again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. Morgan had just committed herself to a course of action that went far beyond unofficial intelligence sharing or unauthorized tactical advice. She was going to war dot at 2,130 hours. Morgan Bennett did something that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier. She broke into the Fort Braxton armory. "Ma'am, this is insane," Rodriguez whispered as they crouched in the shadows beside the weapons storage facility. "We're talking about theft of military equipment, unauthorized deployment, direct violation of orders. We're talking about 60 soldiers who are going to die in 6 hours if someone doesn't act." Morgan replied, her fingers working quickly on the electronic lock system. Her security clearance still granted her access to non-classified areas. A bureaucratic oversight that she was now exploiting. "Rodriguez, you can still walk away. This doesn't have to be your career ending too. With respect, ma'am, screw that." Rodriguez adjusted the tactical pack on her shoulders. "Those soldiers deserve better than dying because some colonel's too proud to listen to good intelligence." The lock clicked open, and Morgan felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with terror. Every step from here was a federal crime, but she had passed the point where legal considerations mattered more than moral ones. Inside the armory, Morgan moved with practiced efficiency, selecting equipment that would be useful for a reconnaissance and potential rescue operation. 2 M4 carbines with suppressors, night vision equipment, communications gear, medical supplies, and enough ammunition for a sustained engagement. She had done similar equipment draws dozens of times, but never as an unauthorized operation that could land her in federal prison. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said as she loaded magazines, "what exactly is our mission profile here? Because if we're talking about 2 people against 500 enemy combatants, we're not engaging 500 hostiles," Morgan said, strapping on tactical gear that felt familiar despite the months of administrative exile. "Our mission is intelligence gathering, early warning, and emergency extraction support if needed. We get close enough to confirm enemy positions, maintain communication with Alpha Company, and provide whatever assistance we can if things go wrong." "And if things go very wrong?" Morgan paused in her equipment preparation. "Then 2 people with superior tactical positioning and surprise can do a lot of damage before superior numbers matter." They finished their preparations in silence, both women understanding the magnitude of what they were attempting. Morgan checked her watch, 2,147 hours. Alpha Company had deployed 37 minutes ago and would be reaching their operational area within the hour. "Rodriguez, last chance to reconsider this." "Ma'am, I've been in the Army for 12 years. I've seen good officers and bad officers, smart decisions and stupid decisions. What I've never seen is someone willing to sacrifice their career to save soldiers they've never met." Rodriguez shouldered her rifle. "If you're going out there, I'm going with you." They slipped out of Fort Braxton through a maintenance gate that Rodriguez knew from her years on base security rotations. The night was moonless, which would provide concealment, but also make navigation more difficult. Morgan had plotted their route carefully, a 40-mile movement through difficult terrain that would position them in the hills, overlooking training area Charlie before Alpha Company reached their objective. For the first hour, they moved in complete silence, following deer trails and ridgelines that kept them away from roads and established patrol routes. Morgan felt muscles she hadn't used in months responding to the familiar rhythm of tactical movement, her body remembering skills that her current assignment had forced into dormancy. At 2,300 hours, they paused at a checkpoint Morgan had identified on the topographical maps. From this elevated position, they could see the lights of training area Charlie in the distance, a small cluster of illumination in the vast darkness of the mountains. Alpha Company should be establishing their base camp right about now, Morgan said quietly, adjusting her night vision equipment to scan the area below. Rodriguez was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, listening for communication from both Alpha Company and any enemy forces in the area. "Ma'am, I'm picking up movement signals on the enemy frequencies. Sounds like they're positioning themselves exactly where you predicted." Morgan felt ice form in her stomach. Part of her had hoped she was wrong, that her tactical analysis was flawed, that 60 soldiers weren't actually walking into a carefully prepared killing field. But the radio intercepts confirmed her worst fears. "What are they saying?" "It's coded, but the positioning reports match your intelligence assessment. They've got observation posts on the 3 main exit routes, mobile assault teams moving into flanking positions, and what sounds like heavy weapons being positioned on the ridgelines." Morgan studied the terrain through her night vision scope, identifying the locations where enemy forces would logically establish their positions. "Rodriguez, we need to get closer. If we can identify their exact positioning, we might be able to warn Alpha Company about specific threats." They began moving again, descending toward training area Charlie through terrain that became increasingly treacherous. Morgan's tactical training took over, evaluating sight lines, cover positions, and potential escape routes with the automatic analysis of someone who had spent years thinking about battlefield geometry. At 2,345 hours, they reached a position approximately 800 meters from Alpha Company's base camp. Through her scope, Morgan could see the Rangers establishing their perimeter, setting up communication equipment, and preparing for what they believed was a routine training exercise. "Ma'am," Rodriguez whispered urgently, "enemy movement, you're..." 10 o'clock. Morgan shifted her scope and felt her blood run cold. A team of enemy fighters was moving along the ridgeline above Alpha Company's position, clearly conducting final reconnaissance before the planned assault. She counted at least 12 combatants, all carrying assault rifles and what appeared to be rocket-propelled grenades. They're in position for a dawn assault, Morgan realized. Classic tactical doctrine, hit them when they're least alert, maximum psychological impact, minimal chance for organized resistance. Rodriguez continued monitoring radio frequencies while Morgan conducted systematic observation of enemy positions. What she saw confirmed every element of her tactical analysis. The enemy had spent days preparing a textbook encirclement operation, with positioning that would make escape virtually impossible once the assault began. "Rodriguez, patch me through to Alpha Company on the secure channel." "Ma'am, direct communication will compromise our position and potentially alert enemy monitoring stations. Our position doesn't matter if Alpha Company gets overrun." Morgan keyed the radio. "Alpha 6, this is Overwatch. Priority traffic." The response came immediately. "Overwatch, this is Alpha 6. Identify yourself." "Alpha 6, this is Captain Bennett providing unsolicited tactical support. You have immediate hostile presence in your operational area. Recommend you implement emergency defensive procedures immediately." A pause. "Overwatch, confirm your position and authorization for this communication." Morgan looked at Rodriguez, who nodded grimly. There was no point in maintaining operational security when the mission was already completely unauthorized. Alpha 6, my authorization is 60 American soldiers who are about to be killed if someone doesn't provide accurate intelligence. I am positioned approximately 800 meters northwest of your location, with direct observation of hostile forces. Overwatch. Captain Bennett, is that you? Affirmative, Alpha 6. Lieutenant Carter, I'm looking at enemy positions right now. You've got at least 12 hostiles with heavy weapons positioned on the ridgeline directly above your camp. Additional forces are moving into flanking positions on your east and west approaches. The radio was quiet for nearly 30 seconds. When Carter responded, his voice was tight with stress. Overwatch, our perimeter security hasn't detected any hostile presence. Because they're positioned above your detection capability and they're maintaining radio silence except for coded positioning reports. Alpha 6, this is not a training exercise anymore. You are in immediate danger. Morgan continued her systematic observation while maintaining radio contact with Carter. What she saw made the situation even worse than her original assessment. The enemy force was larger than intelligence had estimated. She was counting at least 400 combatants in coordinated positions, not the 200 that had been reported in the official briefings. Alpha 6, I'm updating my count. You've got approximately 400 hostiles in prepared positions surrounding your area of operations. They're equipped with heavy weapons, explosives, and what appears to be sophisticated communication equipment. Jesus Christ! Carter's voice cracked slightly. Overwatch, what's your recommendation? Morgan studied the tactical situation, her mind racing through possibilities. Alpha Company was positioned in a valley with limited cover and 3 exit routes, all of which were now controlled by enemy forces. A direct assault would be suicide. Attempting to break through enemy lines would result in massive casualties. But staying in position would guarantee annihilation when the assault began. Alpha 6, you need to implement immediate defensive measures. Establish fighting positions using whatever cover is available. Prepare charges to destroy your equipment if position becomes untenable. Most importantly, request immediate extraction. Support from Battalion. Overwatch, we've already tried to contact Battalion. Communication systems are being jammed. Morgan felt her heart sink. Communication jamming meant the enemy was more sophisticated than anyone had realized. This wasn't an opportunistic insurgent attack. It was a carefully planned military operation designed to achieve maximum tactical advantage. Alpha 6, electronic warfare capabilities confirm this is a coordinated assault by organized forces. Your situation is now critical. Rodriguez grabbed Morgan's arm, pointing toward the valley where Alpha Company was positioned. Ma'am, look. Morgan swung her scope toward Rodriguez's indicated direction and saw movement that made her blood run cold. Enemy assault teams were moving into final positions, their movements coordinated and professional. She estimated they would be ready to launch their attack within 2 hours. Alpha 6, hostile forces are moving into assault positions. You've got approximately 2 hours before they initiate contact. Overwatch, with communication systems jammed, we can't request immediate support. What are options? Morgan studied the terrain again, looking for any tactical advantage that might help 60 Rangers survive against overwhelming odds. The valley offered limited defensive positions, but there was a series of rocky outcroppings on the northern slope that could provide cover for a fighting withdrawal. Alpha 6, I'm going to transmit GPS coordinates for defensive positions that offer your best chance of survival. Move your entire unit to those positions immediately and prepare for sustained combat. Overwatch, understand we're transitioning from training exercise to combat operations? Affirmative, Alpha 6. This is now a combat situation against organized enemy forces with superior numbers and positioning. Morgan began transmitting coordinates while Rodriguez continued monitoring enemy communications. The next 2 hours would determine whether her unauthorized intervention had saved 60 lives or simply delayed an inevitable disaster. But for the first time in 18 months, Captain Morgan Bennett was doing what she had been trained to do: leading soldiers in combat, making life-and-death decisions under impossible pressure, and proving that someone who had been deemed unfit to lead was exactly the person those soldiers needed. The real battle was about to begin. At 0347 hours, the enemy made their first mistake. Morgan watched through her night vision scope as an advance reconnaissance team broke cover too early, moving down the eastern slope toward Alpha Company's new defensive positions. The team leader was checking his watch repeatedly, clearly operating on a strict timeline that didn't account for the Rangers' unexpected repositioning. Rodriguez marked that patrol. 4 combatants, assault rifles, moving toward grid reference 347 to 192. Marked. "Ma'am, they're heading directly toward Lieutenant Ramirez's position." Morgan keyed her radio. "Alpha 6, this is Overwatch. You've got 4 hostiles approaching your eastern perimeter, approximately 200 meters out in closing. They don't appear to know you've repositioned." Carter's voice came back immediately. "Overwatch, should we engage?" It was the question Morgan had been dreading. Once Alpha Company opened fire, there would be no going back. The enemy would know their assault had been compromised, and they would adapt accordingly. But if those 4 scouts reached Alpha Company's perimeter and reported back, the entire defensive strategy would collapse. "Alpha 6, those scouts cannot be allowed to report your new positions. Recommend silent elimination if possible." Overwatch understood. "Alpha 2, you copy that?" "Alpha 6, this is Alpha 2. We have visual on the patrol." Requesting permission to engage, Morgan held her breath. Alpha 2 was Staff Sergeant Williams, one of Alpha Company's most experienced NCOs. If anyone could handle a silent elimination, it would be Williams and his team. "Alpha 2, you are cleared to engage. Make it clean." Through her scope, Morgan watched as Williams' team moved with practiced precision. They had positioned themselves in the rocky outcroppings she had recommended, giving them both cover and elevation advantage over the approaching enemy scouts. The engagement was over in less than 30 seconds. 4 suppressed rifle shots, barely audible even to Morgan's enhanced hearing equipment, and the enemy patrol simply disappeared into the darkness. Williams' team dragged the bodies into concealment and resumed their defensive positions without missing a beat. "Alpha 6, this is Alpha 2. 4 hostiles neutralized, bodies concealed. No compromise of position. Outstanding work, Alpha 2." Carter's voice carried relief and growing confidence. "Overwatch, what's our next consideration?" Morgan continued scanning enemy positions, noting increased radio chatter and movement that suggested confusion about the missing patrol. "Alpha 6, the enemy's timeline is now disrupted. They're going to investigate when that patrol fails to report in. Estimate 15 minutes before they realize something's wrong." "Copy that. All Alpha elements, maintain defensive positions and prepare for accelerated timeline." Rodriguez had been monitoring enemy communications with increasing urgency. "Ma'am, they're definitely looking for their missing patrol. Sounds like they're moving up their assault timeline." Morgan studied the tactical display she had sketched based on her observations. The enemy's original plan had been sophisticated but predictable: a coordinated dawn assault from multiple directions designed to overwhelm Alpha Company through sheer numbers and surprise. But missing patrols would force them to adapt, and adaptation under pressure often led to mistakes. "Rodriguez, what's your assessment of their command structure?" "Sounds centralized, ma'am. Single command frequency, coordinating all elements. If we could identify their command post, we could disrupt their coordination." Morgan felt a familiar surge of tactical excitement. Rodriguez, start triangulating their command signals. If we can locate their command element, we might be able to shift the odds significantly. While Rodriguez worked on signal analysis, Morgan maintained overwatch of Alpha Company's positions and continued monitoring enemy movement. What she saw both encouraged and terrified her. The Rangers were performing superbly, using the defensive positions she had recommended to establish interlocking fields of fire that would make any assault extremely costly. But they were still outnumbered nearly 7-1, and the enemy was positioning heavy weapons that could neutralize even the best defensive positions. Alpha 6, this is Overwatch. I'm observing heavy weapons emplacements being positioned on the western ridge. Looks like at least 2 RPG teams, and what might be a recoilless rifle. Overwatch, can you provide targeting data for counter-battery? Fire. Morgan felt a moment of pride in Carter's tactical thinking. The young lieutenant was adapting quickly to combat conditions, asking the right questions and making smart decisions under extreme pressure. Alpha 6, transmitting coordinates now. But be aware that counter-battery fire will reveal your positions to their entire force. Understood, Overwatch. But those heavy weapons will kill us all if we let them establish firing positions. Morgan transmitted the targeting coordinates while mentally calculating the tactical implications. Carter was right. The heavy weapons represented an existential threat that had to be eliminated. But the noise and muzzle flashes from Alpha Company's return fire would pinpoint their positions for every enemy fighter in the area. Alpha 6 recommends simultaneous engagement of all observed heavy weapons positions to minimize their ability to coordinate return fire. Copy that. All Alpha elements, prepare for coordinated strike on heavy weapons positions. Fire on my command in 3.2.1. Execute. The night exploded with gunfire as 6 different Ranger positions opened up simultaneously on the enemy heavy weapons teams. Morgan watched through her scope as the precisely targeted fire destroyed equipment and scattered personnel. But she also saw the immediate response as hundreds of enemy fighters began moving toward the source of the gunfire. Alpha 6, excellent shooting, but you've got the entire enemy force converging on your position now. Estimate contact in 10 minutes. Overwatch, what's your recommendation? Morgan studied the developing tactical situation, her mind racing through possibilities. Alpha Company had eliminated the immediate heavy weapons threat, but they were now facing the main assault under less than ideal conditions. The enemy would be expecting prepared positions, but not the specific locations where the Rangers had repositioned. Alpha 6, they're going to probe your perimeter before committing to a full assault. Use that time to adjust your positions and prepare surprises. Make them pay for every meter they advance. Copy that. All Alpha elements, prepare for contact. Remember your fields of fire and stay disciplined. Rodriguez grabbed Morgan's arm urgently. Ma'am, I've got their command frequency isolated. Command post is approximately 400 meters south of Alpha Company's position, probably in that cluster of buildings we identified earlier. Morgan swung her scope toward the indicated location and felt her heart race. The enemy command post was positioned perfectly to coordinate the assault, but was also vulnerable to a flanking attack from someone with the right equipment and training. Rodriguez, what's your assessment of our ability to disrupt their command and control? Ma'am, if we could get close enough, 2 people with suppressors could cause significant confusion. But it would mean leaving Alpha Company without Overwatch support. It was an impossible choice. Morgan could maintain her current position and provide intelligence and coordination support to Alpha Company, helping them fight defensively against overwhelming odds. Or she could attempt to disrupt the enemy's command structure, potentially giving the Rangers a tactical advantage but leaving them without eyes on the broader battlefield. The decision was made for her when the first probing attack began. Enemy fighters began moving toward Alpha Company's positions in small teams. testing the Rangers' response and trying to identify weaknesses in their defensive perimeter. Morgan watched as Alpha Company's disciplined fire drove back the initial probes, but she could see larger formations moving into position for the main assault. Alpha 6, probing attacks are just reconnaissance. They're identifying your automatic weapons positions and looking for gaps in your coverage. The real attack is still coming. Overwatch, how long do we have? Morgan assessed the enemy's preparation timeline and felt ice form in her stomach. Alpha 6, estimate 15 minutes before main assault commences. They're going to hit you with everything they have. Copy that. All Alpha elements, conserve ammunition and prepare for sustained engagement. The radio chatter from Alpha Company revealed the stress they were under, but also their professionalism and determination. These were well-trained soldiers led by competent officers, fighting for their lives against odds that would have broken less disciplined units. But discipline and training would only go so far against a 7-to-1 numerical disadvantage. Rodriguez, Morgan said quietly, I'm going to make a run at their command post. You maintain overwatch and coordination with Alpha Company. Ma'am, that's suicide. You can't assault a command post single-handed. I'm not planning to assault it. I'm planning to disrupt it long enough to give Alpha Company a fighting chance. Morgan began checking her equipment and preparing for movement. Rodriguez, if I don't make it back, make sure someone knows what happened here. Make sure they know that Alpha Company died fighting, not because they weren't good enough. Ma'am, you're coming back. Alpha Company is going to survive this, and so are you. Morgan looked through her scope one last time at the Rangers defending their positions with courage and skill that would have made their instructors proud. In 18 months of administrative exile, she had forgotten what it felt like to be responsible for soldiers' lives, to make decisions that would determine who lived and who died. She hadn't forgotten how to make those decisions. Rodriguez, I'm moving in 5 minutes. Maintain radio contact with Alpha Company and provide whatever support you can. The main battle was about to begin, and Captain Morgan Bennett was going to war against impossible odds to save 60 soldiers she had never met. It was exactly what she had been trained to do. Morgan moved through the darkness like a ghost, every step calculated to avoid detection as she approached the enemy command post. Behind her, the sound of gunfire erupted as Alpha Company engaged the main assault force. She had 15 minutes, maybe 20, before the enemy's superior numbers would overwhelm the Rangers' defensive positions. The command post was situated in a cluster of abandoned mining buildings that provided both concealment and elevation overlooking the battlefield. Through her night vision scope, Morgan could see at least 12 enemy fighters around the perimeter, with communication antennas and equipment that confirmed this was their operational center. She paused 150 meters from the target, her mind automatically calculating angles of approach, fields of fire, and escape routes. The tactical problem was straightforward, but nearly impossible. Eliminate or disrupt a heavily defended command post with limited ammunition and no backup. While enemy forces were at their highest state of alert, the sound of intensifying gunfire from Alpha Company's position reminded her that analysis time was a luxury she couldn't afford. Morgan selected her approach route along a dry creek bed that would provide concealment and bring her within 50 meters of the command post's eastern flank. The rocky terrain was treacherous in the darkness, but it offered cover from observation and would muffle the sound of her movement. As she low-crawled through the creek bed, Morgan could hear voices from the command post speaking in what sounded like a mixture of Arabic and Russian, confirming her assessment that this was a sophisticated, well-trained force rather than local insurgents. The multilingual coordination suggested foreign fighters with military experience, possibly former special forces or mercenaries. At 40 meters from the command post, Morgan could clearly observe the enemy's setup through her scope. The commander appeared to be a tall figure in tactical gear, standing beside a sophisticated radio array. coordinating the assault on Alpha Company through a combination of voice commands and digital communications. 2 communications specialists worked frantically at equipment that looked far more advanced than standard insurgent capabilities. Morgan counted 8 guards in immediate proximity to the command team, all carrying assault rifles and positioned to provide overlapping coverage of the approaches. A direct assault would be suicide, but she wasn't planning a direct assault. She was planning something much more dangerous. Morgan pulled out a small device that would have gotten her court-martialed. In peacetime, a signal jamming unit that she had borrowed from the electronic warfare section during her equipment acquisition. The device could disrupt enemy communications for approximately 10 minutes before its battery died or before the enemy traced its location and destroyed it. But 10 minutes of communication disruption during a coordinated assault would create chaos in the enemy's command structure, potentially giving Alpha Company the tactical advantage they needed to survive. The challenge was positioning the jammer close enough to be effective while avoiding the immediate death that would result. From detection, Morgan studied the terrain around the command post, looking for any advantage she could exploit. The abandoned mining buildings were connected by a series of wooden walkways and maintenance tunnels, some of which appeared to extend beyond the enemy's security perimeter. Moving with infinite care, she worked her way along the creek bed to a point where one of the maintenance tunnels emerged from beneath the largest building. The tunnel entrance was partially concealed by debris and overgrowth, suggesting the enemy hadn't identified it as a potential security vulnerability. The tunnel was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, filled with spider webs, debris, and the smell of decades of abandonment. Morgan forced herself forward, fighting claustrophobia and the knowledge that if she was discovered in this confined space, she would die without any possibility of fighting back. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, she reached a point where she could hear voices directly above her. Through gaps in the wooden flooring, she could see the legs and equipment of the enemy command team. She was literally underneath their operational center. Morgan positioned the signal jammer in the tunnel, directly beneath the radio equipment, and activated its timer. In 3 minutes, every enemy radio within a 500-meter radius would go silent simultaneously. But she wasn't finished. While the jammer would disrupt communications, it wouldn't eliminate the command structure itself. The enemy commander would eventually restore communications and continue coordinating the assault. To give Alpha Company a real advantage, she needed to create lasting disruption. Morgan pulled out 2 fragmentation grenades, the last of her explosive ordnance, and began calculating timing and placement. She had one chance to eliminate the command team before the jammer activated and alerted every enemy fighter to her presence. Through the floor gaps, she could see the commander leaning over a tactical display, directing assault teams with the confidence of someone who believed victory was inevitable. In 90 seconds, he was going to discover exactly how wrong that assumption was. Morgan positioned herself directly beneath the command table and prepared her grenades. The wooden floor would channel most of the blast upward, but she would need to be moving immediately after detonation to avoid the debris and return fire that would follow. At 60 seconds before the jammer activated, she pulled the pins on both grenades. At 30 seconds, she positioned them for maximum effect against the command structure. At 10 seconds, she began moving toward her escape route. At 0 seconds, everything went to hell. The first grenade detonated directly beneath the radio equipment, destroying the communication array and killing both specialists instantly. The second grenade exploded among the command team, eliminating the commander and 2 senior officers in a blast that turned the operational center into a scene of chaos and destruction. Simultaneously, the signal jammer activated, cutting off all radio communications just as enemy forces throughout the battlefield were trying to report the attack on their command post. Morgan was moving before the debris stopped falling, crawling frantically through the tunnel as automatic weapons Fire erupted above her. The enemy guards were shooting blindly into the smoke and confusion, unable to determine the source of the attack or coordinate their response without communications. She reached the tunnel exit as explosions began detonating throughout the command post area. Whether the enemy was using grenades to clear the tunnels or accidentally triggering their own ordnance in the chaos, she couldn't tell. What mattered was reaching safety before they restored enough order to organize a systematic search. Morgan emerged from the tunnel and immediately began moving toward her extraction route, staying low and using the confusion to mask her movement. Behind her, the command post was in flames, with enemy fighters running in multiple directions without coordination or clear objectives. Her radio crackled to life, Rodriguez's voice cutting through the static of battlefield communications. "Overwatch. This is Rodriguez. I don't know what you just did, but the entire enemy force just went silent simultaneously. Alpha Company is reporting that the assault has completely stopped." Morgan felt a surge of exhaustion and relief. "Rodriguez, enemy command structure is eliminated. Their communications are down and coordination is disrupted. Tell Alpha Company to press their advantage while the enemy is confused." "Copy that." "Ma'am, Alpha 6, this is Rodriguez. Enemy command and control is down. Recommend immediate counterattack while they're disorganized." Carter's voice came through the radio with new confidence. "Rodriguez, understand enemy is vulnerable to counterattack?" "Affirmative, Alpha 6. Their coordination is completely broken. This is your opportunity." Morgan reached a position where she could observe both the destroyed command post and Alpha Company's defensive positions. What she saw filled her with professional satisfaction. The Rangers were already adapting to the changed tactical situation, shifting from defensive positions to aggressive fire and movement that was pushing back enemy forces who no longer had coordinated leadership, but her satisfaction was short-lived. Through her scope, she could see enemy officers attempting to restore order, and she knew that professional soldiers wouldn't remain disorganized for long. The advantage she had created was temporary, maybe 20 minutes before they established alternative command arrangements. "Rodriguez, the confusion won't last long. Alpha Company needs to use this window to either eliminate the remaining enemy forces or reach an extraction point. Ma'am, Alpha 6 is requesting your assessment of enemy capabilities after your ... intervention." Morgan conducted a systematic scan of the battlefield, counting remaining enemy forces and assessing their current disposition. What she saw was both encouraging and concerning. "Rodriguez, enemy force is reduced by approximately 30%. Between casualties from the command post attack and Alpha Company's defensive fire. But they still have numerical superiority, and they're beginning to reorganize around secondary leadership. What's your recommendation?" Morgan studied the tactical situation, weighing Alpha Company's current position against the remaining enemy capabilities. The Rangers had proven they could fight effectively against superior numbers, but they were running low on ammunition, and the enemy would eventually restore coordination. "Rodriguez, Alpha Company needs to transition to mobile operations. They can't hold fixed positions against reorganized enemy forces. Recommend fighting withdrawal to Extraction Point Bravo." Extraction Point Bravo was a clearing approximately 2 kilometers from their current position, where helicopter extraction would be possible. But reaching it would require Alpha Company to move through terrain controlled by enemy forces who, despite their current confusion, still outnumbered the Rangers 3-1. "Alpha 6, this is Rodriguez. Overwatch recommends fighting withdrawal to Extraction Point Bravo. Can you execute movement under current conditions?" Carter's response was immediate. "Rodriguez, we can move, but we'll need guidance through enemy-controlled terrain. Request Overwatch resume coordination duties." Morgan looked back at the burning command post, then toward Alpha Company's positions where 60 Rangers were preparing to fight their way through enemy territory to reach safety. 18 months of administrative exile had ended in the most dangerous mission of her career, but it was far from over. Rodriguez, tell Alpha 6 that Overwatch is moving to support their withdrawal. We're going to get every one of those soldiers home. The hardest part of the battle was just beginning. The withdrawal began at 0431 hours, with Alpha Company's first squad disappearing into the darkness like professional ghosts. Their movements so coordinated that Morgan had to use her night vision scope to track their progress. Lieutenant Carter had divided his force into 3 elements: an advance team to secure the route, a main body protecting their wounded, and a rear guard to delay pursuit. Alpha 6, this is Overwatch, Morgan transmitted from her new position, overlooking the withdrawal route. Your advance element is clear for the first 400 meters. I have visual on scattered enemy forces, but they're still disorganized. Copy, Overwatch. Alpha 2 is moving to secure checkpoint Charlie. Morgan watched Staff Sergeant Williams lead his team through terrain that would have challenged experienced mountaineers, even in daylight. The Rangers moved with the fluid precision of soldiers who had trained together for months, each man knowing exactly where his teammates were and what his role was in the tactical formation. But Morgan also saw what the Rangers couldn't: enemy forces beginning to coalesce around new leadership, their initial confusion giving way to systematic pursuit. She counted at least 150 fighters reorganizing into hunting parties, and more were arriving from positions that had been outside the range of her command post attack. Rodriguez, what's your status on enemy communications? Ma'am, they've restored local communications using backup equipment. Not as sophisticated as their primary systems, but functional enough for basic coordination. Time estimate until they organize effective pursuit? Maybe 10 minutes before they have coordinated teams moving, 15 before they establish new command protocols. Morgan calculated distances and movement rates in her head. Alpha Company was making good time, but they had nearly 2 kilometers of hostile territory to cross before reaching the extraction point. Even with their head start, the enemy's superior numbers and local terrain knowledge would eventually tell. Alpha 6, be advised that enemy is restoring communications and organizing pursuit. Estimate you have 20 minutes before organized. Resistance. Understood, Overwatch. Alpha 3, increase pace to tactical bounds. The main body began moving faster, but Morgan could see the cost in their formation discipline. Soldiers were carrying wounded teammates, heavy equipment, and the exhaustion of a night-long firefight. They were pushing themselves beyond normal human limits, but physics and physiology were unforgiving equations. At 0445 hours, the first contact came sooner than expected. Alpha 6, this is Alpha 2. Contact front, approximately 10 hostiles blocking our route at checkpoint Charlie. Morgan swung her scope toward the indicated position and saw exactly what Williams was reporting. An enemy squad had positioned themselves in a cluster of rocks that provided excellent cover and commanding views of the only practical route toward the extraction point. Alpha 2, this is Overwatch. I have visual on your contact. Enemy position is well sighted, but has limited depth. Recommend flanking movement to your right, while main body provides supporting fire. Copy that, Overwatch. Alpha 2 moving to flank. Morgan watched the textbook assault unfold below her. Williams divided his team, sent 2 soldiers on a wide flanking movement, while the other 2 provided accurate covering fire that kept the enemy pinned in their positions. Within 3 minutes, the flanking element was in position to assault the enemy position from their blind side. Alpha 2, you are clear to engage. Flanking element in position. The assault was swift and decisive. Coordinated fire from multiple directions overwhelmed the enemy squad before they could respond effectively. Within moments, the route was clear and Alpha Company's advance element was moving forward again. But Morgan had spotted something that made her blood run cold. Alpha 6, this is Overwatch. you've got a major problem developing. I'm observing large enemy formations moving to intercept your route to the extraction point. They're not just pursuing, they're trying to cut off your escape. Overwatch, how large are we talking? Morgan conducted a systematic count of the enemy forces she could observe, her stomach sinking with each additional group she identified. Alpha 6, I count at least 200 hostiles in organized formations, moving to establish blocking positions between your current location and extraction point Bravo. The radio was silent for nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in combat communications, before Carter responded. Overwatch recommend alternate extraction point. Morgan studied her tactical maps, looking for alternatives that wouldn't require Alpha Company to fight through even more enemy territory. The terrain limited their options severely. Mountains to the north and east, a river to the south that was too deep and fast to cross under fire, and the enemy's main force to the west. Alpha 6, I'm not seeing viable alternatives. Extraction Point Bravo is still your best option, but you're going to have to fight for it. Understood. All Alpha elements, prepare for sustained contact. We're going to punch through to the extraction point. Morgan felt a surge of pride in Carter's decision. The young lieutenant could have ordered his men to find hiding positions and wait for rescue, but he understood that passive defense against superior numbers was just slow suicide. Alpha Company was going to fight their way out, but they were going to need help. Rodriguez, what's your assessment of our ability to disrupt enemy blocking positions? Ma'am, we've got limited ammunition and they're spread across a wide front. We can cause casualties, but we can't break up formations that size. Morgan studied the developing tactical situation, looking for any advantage she could exploit. The enemy was making the same mistake that had cost them their command post. They were concentrating their forces in predictable positions, assuming that superior numbers guaranteed victory. Rodriguez, I've got an idea, but it's going to require splitting up. Ma'am, we're already outnumbered about 200 to 1. Splitting up seems like a bad tactical decision. Not if we can convince them they're facing a larger force than they realize. Morgan began sketching a plan that would have horrified any conventional military planner. Rodriguez, you're going to provide overwatch and coordination for Alpha Company's main assault. I'm going to create a diversion that draws enemy forces away from their blocking positions. What kind of diversion? The kind that makes them think they're being attacked by a reinforced company instead of one very motivated captain. Morgan began moving toward a position that would allow her to engage the enemy's flank while they were focused on Alpha Company's approach. Her plan was based on a principle she had learned in asymmetric warfare training. Perception often mattered more than reality on the battlefield. If she could create enough chaos in the right places at the right times, the enemy might believe they were facing multiple coordinated attacks from different directions. In the confusion, they might pull forces away from the critical blocking positions, giving Alpha Company the opening they needed. At 0507 hours, Alpha Company's main body made contact with the first enemy blocking position. Alpha 6, this is Alpha 4. Heavy contact. Grid reference 445 to 278. Requesting immediate support. Morgan could see the firefight erupting in the valley below her position. Alpha Company was engaging a well-positioned enemy force that outnumbered them significantly, but the Rangers' superior training and discipline were allowing them to hold their own. Alpha 6, this is Overwatch. Beginning diversionary attack in 3 minutes. When you see explosions on the eastern ridge, that's your signal to press the assault. Copy, Overwatch. Standing by for your signal. Morgan moved into position 300 meters from the enemy's eastern flank, where a large group of fighters was waiting to reinforce the blocking positions. She had 4 grenades remaining, and a plan that would either create the diversion Alpha Company needed or get her killed in the next 5 minutes, probably both. She began her assault by targeting the enemy's ammunition storage area, lobbing grenades. into positions where she had observed heavy weapons and supply concentrations. The explosions created exactly the effect she had hoped for. Massive secondary explosions as enemy ammunition detonated, sending fighters scrambling for cover and reinforcements, rushing toward what they believed was a major assault on their flank. Alpha 6, execute assault now. The next 5 minutes were the longest of Morgan's military career. She moved continuously, engaging targets of opportunity while avoiding the increasingly organized enemy response to her position. Her suppressed rifle allowed her to eliminate individual targets without revealing her exact location, but the enemy was adapting quickly, using coordinated fire to force her to keep moving. Meanwhile, Alpha Company pressed their assault with the ferocity of soldiers who knew their lives depended on reaching the extraction point. The diversion had drawn enough enemy forces away from the blocking positions to create gaps in their defensive line, and the Rangers exploited those gaps with professional ruthlessness. Alpha 6, this is Alpha 4. We're through the first blocking. Position: moving toward extraction point Bravo. Outstanding, Alpha 4. All elements maintain momentum. Morgan continued her one-woman war against the enemy's eastern flank, but she could feel the tactical situation shifting. The enemy was beginning to understand that they were facing a small force using deception rather than a major assault, and they were redirecting their efforts toward the Rangers' actual breakthrough. Rodriguez, enemy is realigning to counter Alpha Company's movement. They're going to mass forces at the extraction point. Ma'am, Alpha 6 needs to know if the extraction point is still viable. Morgan moved to a position where she could observe the extraction clearing and felt her heart sink. The enemy had anticipated Alpha Company's objective and was positioning heavy weapons to turn the extraction point into a killing field. Rodriguez, tell Alpha 6 that extraction point Bravo is compromised. Heavy enemy presence, prepared positions, interlocking fields of fire. Landing there would be suicide for any extraction aircraft. Ma'am, what's the alternative? Morgan studied the terrain around the extraction point, looking for any possibility that would allow 60 Rangers to survive the next hour. What she found was a tactical problem that would test every skill she had developed in 15 years of military service. Rodriguez, tell Alpha 6 to hold position and prepare for one more impossible mission. We're going to have to clear the extraction point ourselves. The final battle was about to begin. At 0542 hours, Morgan Bennett stared at what military tacticians would later call an impossible problem. 60 Rangers needed to assault a heavily fortified position defended by over 100 enemy fighters with no artillery support, limited ammunition, and an extraction window that would close in 23 minutes. Alpha 6, this is Overwatch. I need a complete ammunition and casualty report before we plan this assault. Carter's voice came back strained but determined. Overwatch, we've got 7 wounded, none critical. Ammunition status is ... concerning. Most squads are down to less than 3 magazines per soldier. Morgan felt the weight of mathematics settling on her shoulders. 3 magazines meant roughly 90 rounds per soldier, enough for perhaps 10 minutes of sustained firefight, assuming perfect accuracy and no mechanical failures. Against entrenched positions with superior numbers, it would be over in 5 minutes. Alpha 6, what's your assessment of morale and fighting capability? Overwatch, these soldiers have been in continuous combat for 6 hours, and they're still asking when we assault the extraction point, not if we assault it. Morale is not an issue. Through her scope, Morgan studied the extraction clearing with the methodical analysis of someone whose plans had to be perfect, because there would be no second chances. The enemy had positioned themselves brilliantly. Machine gun nests covering all approaches, RPG teams on elevated positions that could destroy any helicopter attempting to land, and interlocking fields of fire that would cut down anyone attempting to cross the open ground. But they had also made assumptions based on conventional military thinking. They expected Alpha Company to attempt a frontal assault across the clearing, or to approach from the most obvious covered routes. They weren't expecting the kind of tactically insane maneuver that Morgan was beginning to formulate. Rodriguez, what's your assessment of enemy positioning around the extraction point? Ma'am, they've established a classic defensive perimeter. Strong points at the cardinal directions, mobile reserves in the center, overlapping coverage of all obvious approaches. What about non-obvious approaches? Rodriguez studied the terrain through her own scope. Ma'am, there's a drainage ravine that runs along the northern edge of the clearing. It's steep, probably unstable, and it would put any assault force directly under the guns of their eastern strong point, which is exactly why they won't expect us to use it. Morgan began sketching a plan that violated every principle of conventional assault tactics. Instead of attacking the enemy's weakest point, she was going to attack their strongest, the eastern position that dominated the drainage ravine, because it was the one place they would least expect a coordinated assault. Rodriguez, I need you to move to a position where you can provide precision fire on their eastern strong point. When I give the signal, I want you to eliminate their machine gun team with aimed shots. Ma'am, one sniper against a fortified position won't destroy the position, but will create confusion and force them to react. Alpha Company will use that confusion to assault through the drainage ravine while the enemy is focused on your location. And what will you be doing during this assault? Morgan checked her remaining equipment: 2 magazines for her rifle, 1 fragmentation grenade, and a demolition charge she had been saving for exactly this type of impossible situation. I'm going to eliminate their command structure and heavy weapons positions while they're distracted by Alpha Company's assault. Rodriguez stared at her. Ma'am, that's a suicide mission disguised as tactics. Rodriguez, everything we've done tonight has been suicide missions disguised as tactics. The only reason we're still alive is that we've been better at it than they have. Morgan keyed her radio to Alpha Company's frequency. Alpha 6, this is Overwatch. I'm transmitting assault. Plan Tango 7. Acknowledge when received. Overwatch receiving transmission now. Morgan outlined her plan in precise tactical language, watching through her scope as Carter's reaction played out in the movements of Alpha Company's formations. The plan was so audacious that it took several minutes for the full implications to register. Overwatch, confirm that you're recommending assault through the drainage ravine while enemy attention is focused on multiple diversions? Affirmative, Alpha 6. Coordinated assault in 4 phases. Rodriguez eliminates Eastern Machine Gun Team. Alpha Company assaults through ravine. I eliminate enemy command and heavy weapons. All elements converge on extraction point simultaneously. Overwatch. What's our timeline for extraction aircraft? Morgan checked her watch and felt ice form in her stomach. Alpha 6, extraction window opens in 18 minutes. If we're not in control of that clearing when the helicopters arrive, they won't be able to land and we'll miss our only chance for extraction. Copy that. All Alpha elements, prepare for assault. We've got one chance to get this right. The next few minutes were spent in final preparations that would determine whether 60 Rangers lived or died. Morgan moved to her assault position, a rocky outcropping that would allow her to attack the enemy's command area, but would also expose her to fire from multiple directions once the battle began. Rodriguez positioned herself where she could observe the eastern strong point. Her rifle trained on the machine gun position that controlled access to the drainage ravine. Alpha Company formed up for an assault that would require them to move through terrain so difficult that the enemy couldn't imagine anyone attempting it under fire. At 0558 hours, with the extraction window 12 minutes away, Morgan gave the signal that would begin the most desperate assault of her military career. All elements, commence assault. Rodriguez, take your shot. The crack of Rodriguez's rifle echoed across the clearing as the enemy machine gunner collapsed over his weapon. Immediately, the eastern strong point erupted in confusion as fighters scrambled to replace the gunner and identify the sniper's position. Alpha 6, Eastern position neutralized. Execute assault through ravine. Morgan watched as Alpha Company disappeared into the drainage ravine like water flowing downhill, their movement so coordinated that she could barely track individual soldiers. Staff Sergeant Williams led the advance element, using hand signals to coordinate movement through terrain that would have challenged mountain climbers. While the enemy focused on the threat emerging from the ravine, Morgan began her own assault on their command area. She had identified 3 critical targets: the command post where enemy officers were coordinating the defense, an RPG position that could destroy incoming helicopters, and a heavy machine gun that controlled the center of the extraction clearing. Assault began with her last fragmentation grenade, thrown with the precision of someone who had spent years calculating blast patterns and casualty radii. The explosion destroyed the RPG position and killed 3 fighters, but more importantly, it created chaos in the command area just as Alpha Company emerged from the ravine. Alpha 6, command area under attack. Press your assault now. The next 3 minutes were a masterpiece of coordinated violence. Alpha Company poured out of the drainage ravine with the momentum of soldiers who knew they were fighting for their lives, while Morgan engaged targets throughout the enemy's defensive perimeter with accurate rifle fire that eliminated key personnel and disrupted their coordination. But the enemy was adapting quickly, and Morgan found herself under increasingly heavy fire as they identified her position. Bullets sparked off rocks around her as she moved between cover positions, each location becoming untenable within seconds as enemy fighters concentrated their fire. Overwatch, this is Alpha 4. We're through their perimeter and moving toward the extraction point. What's your status? Morgan assessed her tactical situation while reloading her rifle behind cover that was being systematically destroyed by enemy fire. She had accomplished 2 of her 3 objectives. The command post was eliminated and the RPG position was destroyed, but the heavy machine gun still controlled the center of the clearing where helicopters would need to land. Alpha 4, I still need to eliminate the central machine gun position. Continue assault toward extraction point. Copy that. Alpha 2, assault the machine gun position from your location. Morgan watched as Williams led his team in a direct assault on the heavy machine gun that was keeping the extraction point under fire. The Rangers moved with the precision of soldiers who had trained together for months, using coordinated fire and movement that gradually closed the distance despite heavy enemy resistance. But Williams' assault was costing casualties that Alpha Company couldn't afford. Morgan could see Rangers falling as they advanced across ground that offered minimal cover, their courage and determination measuring against the mathematics of automatic weapons fire. Alpha 2, break off assault. I'm moving to eliminate machine gun position. Overwatch negative. Your position is under heavy fire. Morgan looked at her remaining equipment: 1 magazine, 1 demolition charge, and a desperate plan that would either save Alpha Company or get everyone killed in the next 60 seconds. Alpha 2, trust me on this. When you see the explosion, assault immediately. Morgan began moving toward the machine gun position, using the confusion of the ongoing firefight to mask her approach. The enemy was focused on Alpha Company's assault and Rodriguez's continued sniper fire, giving her an opportunity to close the distance to the heavy weapons position, at 30 meters from the machine gun. She armed the demolition charge, at 20 meters. She calculated the timing that would maximize damage while minimizing the risk to Alpha Company, at 10 meters. She realized that the blast radius would include her own position, at 5 meters. She decided that 60 Rangers were worth more than 1 disgraced logistics officer. Morgan threw the demolition charge directly into the machine gun position and dropped behind the only cover available, a pile of rocks that would provide protection from shrapnel, but not from the massive blast she had just triggered. The explosion lit up the extraction clearing like daylight, destroying the machine gun position and eliminating the last organized resistance between Alpha Company and the extraction point. Alpha 6, clearing is secure. All elements converge on extraction point immediately. Morgan tried to stand and discovered that the blast had left her with injuries that made movement difficult. But through the smoke and confusion, she could see Alpha Company streaming toward the extraction point with the victory they had earned through courage, skill, and impossible determination. In the distance, she could hear the sound of approaching helicopters. They had done it. Against odds that should have been insurmountable, 60 Rangers were going home alive. As Morgan struggled to her feet, she heard Rodriguez's voice on the radio. All stations, extraction aircraft inbound. This is Rodriguez, and I have never been more proud to serve with soldiers like these. The battle was over. Alpha Company had won. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the extraction clearing as two UH-60 Black Hawks descended through the pre-dawn darkness, their crews undoubtedly wondering how 60 Rangers had managed to secure a landing zone that intelligence had reported as heavily defended by enemy forces. Morgan limped toward the extraction point, her left shoulder bleeding from shrapnel and her ears ringing from the demolition blast, but alive and conscious enough to coordinate the final phase of the operation that had consumed the last 8 hours of her life. Alpha 6, this is Overwatch. Extraction birds are on the ground. Load your wounded first, then standard extraction protocol. Carter's voice came back over the radio with an emotion that professional military communication rarely conveyed. Overwatch, we couldn't have done this without you. Every soldier in Alpha Company owes you their life. Through the smoke and chaos of the clearing, Morgan watched as the Rangers loaded their wounded teammates with the same precision they had demonstrated throughout the night. These were soldiers who had been tested beyond normal human limits and had proven themselves worthy of the traditions they represented. Rodriguez appeared beside her, supporting Morgan's injured arm. "Ma'am, you need medical attention. That shrapnel went deeper than you realize. Rodriguez, I need to see every soldier on those helicopters before I worry about medical attention." They moved toward the extraction point where Alpha Company was conducting their withdrawal with textbook efficiency. Despite 8 hours of continuous combat, the Rangers maintained their discipline and professionalism, ensuring that equipment was secured, casualties were properly handled, and no soldier was left behind. Staff Sergeant Williams approached as the last of his squad boarded the first helicopter. "Captain Bennett, Staff Sergeant Williams, Alpha Company. I wanted to thank you personally for what you did tonight." Morgan looked at the veteran NCO, seeing in his face the respect that she had been denied for 18 months by officers who had never proven themselves under fire. "Sergeant Williams, you and your soldiers did the fighting. I just provided some tactical advice." "Ma'am, with respect, what you provided was leadership when our official leaders failed us. Every soldier in Alpha Company knows that we'd be dead right now if you hadn't been willing to risk everything to save us." As Williams boarded the helicopter, Lieutenant Carter approached for what would be their first face-to-face meeting. The young officer looked exhausted but carried himself with the confidence of someone who had successfully led soldiers through impossible circumstances. "Captain Bennett, Lieutenant Carter, I can't adequately express what your actions meant to Alpha Company tonight. Lieutenant, you led your soldiers through 8 hours of combat against overwhelming odds. You earned their respect and their lives through your own courage and competence." Carter paused, clearly struggling with something he needed to say. "Ma'am, when this gets reported up the chain of command, there are going to be questions about unauthorized operations, unofficial tactical support, and violation of orders. I want you to know that Alpha Company will testify to exactly what happened here and who was responsible for our survival." Morgan felt a complex mixture of gratitude and concern. Carter was offering to protect her from the inevitable investigation that would follow, but she knew that his testimony might not be enough to overcome the institutional bias that had already destroyed her career once. Lieutenant, you focus on taking care of your soldiers. Let me worry about the administrative consequences. The second helicopter was loaded and ready for departure when Rodriguez helped Morgan toward the aircraft. As they approached, she could see the faces of Rangers who had spent the night proving themselves in combat, their expressions reflecting the unique combination of exhaustion, relief, and pride that came from surviving an impossible mission. "Ma'am," one of the younger soldiers called out over the helicopter noise, "we heard what you did tonight. Thank you for not giving up on us." Morgan nodded, too emotionally overwhelmed to respond verbally. These soldiers represented everything she had joined the military to protect young Americans who served their country with courage and dedication, trusting that their leaders would make decisions worthy of their sacrifice. As the helicopters lifted off from the extraction clearing, Morgan looked down at the battlefield where Alpha Company had written one of the most remarkable small unit actions in modern military history. The clearing that had been controlled by enemy forces just 20 minutes earlier was now littered with the debris of a defensive position that had been systematically destroyed by soldiers who refused to accept defeat. But Morgan's attention was drawn to movement on the ground that made her blood run cold. "Rodriguez, look at the northern tree line." Through the helicopter's window, they could see enemy survivors emerging from concealment. At least 50 fighters who had survived the assault and were now watching the American helicopters disappear into the dawn sky. More disturbing was the equipment they were carrying: shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles that could have destroyed the extraction aircraft if they had been positioned correctly during the assault. "Ma'am, they had anti-aircraft weapons. If they had used those during the extraction, they didn't use them because their command structure was destroyed and they couldn't coordinate the timing." Morgan felt a chill as she realized how close they had come to disaster even in victory. "Rodriguez, everything had to happen exactly as it did, or we would have lost everyone." The flight back to Fort Braxton gave Morgan time to consider the implications of what had occurred. In the space of 8 hours, she had committed multiple felonies under military law: unauthorized appropriation of weapons and equipment, violation of direct orders, engagement in combat operations without authorization, and destruction of military property. Any one of those charges could result in court-martial and federal imprisonment, but she had also saved 60 lives and prevented what would have been one of the worst military disasters in recent American history. The helicopters landed at Fort Braxton at 0647 hours, just as the morning shift was beginning their daily routines. Medical personnel immediately took charge of the wounded, while Alpha Company was directed to debriefing stations where they would spend the next several hours, explaining exactly what had happened during their training exercise. Morgan was escorted directly to the base hospital, where military doctors treated her shrapnel wounds, while military police officers waited to begin their investigation. Through the hospital window, she could see staff cars arriving as senior officers responded to reports that would fundamentally challenge their understanding of what had occurred during the night. "Captain Bennett," the military policeman said formally, "I'm required to inform you that you're under investigation for multiple violations of military regulations. You have the right to remain silent and the right to legal counsel." "I understand my rights, officer. I'm prepared to provide a complete account of my actions and the reasoning behind them." 3 hours later, Morgan sat in a conference room facing a panel that included Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, Colonel Martinez, who had returned early from the War College, and Major General Patricia Stone, the regional commander. The atmosphere was tense, with Harrison clearly expecting vindication of his operational decisions and the general clearly confused about how a routine training exercise had become a combat operation involving unauthorized personnel and destroyed enemy forces. "Captain Bennett," General Stone began, "your unauthorized actions last night violated numerous military regulations and potentially compromised ongoing operations. However, preliminary reports suggest that your intervention prevented significant casualties among American personnel. I need you to explain, in detail, exactly what happened and why you felt justified in taking unauthorized action. Morgan had spent the morning preparing for this moment, organizing her thoughts and evidence into a presentation that would either vindicate her actions or provide the foundation for her court-martial. General, 18 hours ago, I identified intelligence indicating that Alpha Company was deploying into an enemy ambush. When I attempted to report this assessment through proper channels, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison dismissed my analysis without consideration. Faced with the certainty that 60 American soldiers would be killed if no action was taken, I made the decision to provide tactical support through unofficial means. Harrison's face reddened. Captain Bennett, your so-called tactical assessment was speculation based on incomplete information. My intelligence staff conducted a thorough analysis that concluded. Colonel Harrison, General Stone interrupted sharply. Captain Bennett's assessment proved accurate. Alpha Company encountered approximately 400 enemy combatants and prepared positions, exactly as she predicted. Your intelligence assessment was fundamentally flawed. The room fell silent as the implications settled. Harrison's operational planning had been based on intelligence that was not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong in ways that would have resulted in the annihilation of an entire company. Furthermore, the general continued, consulting reports from the debriefing sessions. Alpha Company's testimony indicates that Captain Bennett's tactical coordination was directly responsible for their survival. Lieutenant Carter states that without her intervention, his entire unit would have been overrun within the first hour of contact. Colonel Martinez, who had remained silent during the initial exchange, leaned forward. Captain Bennett, your tactical background is in asymmetric warfare and counterinsurgency operations, correct? Yes, sir. I have advanced training in unconventional warfare and 3 deployments involving similar enemy tactics. And this expertise was known to the staff who assigned you to logistics duties? Morgan felt the weight of 18 months of professional exile pressing down on her. Sir, my reassignment to logistics was the result of questioning orders during Operation Desert Shield that would have resulted in civilian casualties. Orders that were subsequently proven to be based on flawed intelligence? Yes, sir. General Stone studied Morgan for a long moment before speaking. Captain Bennett, your actions last night violated numerous regulations and created significant administrative complications. However, they also demonstrated exceptional tactical judgment, personal courage, and dedication to protecting American soldiers. These are qualities that the military needs in leadership positions, not logistics assignments. She turned to Harrison. Colonel, your intelligence assessment failed catastrophically, and your dismissal of Captain Bennett's analysis nearly resulted in the loss of an entire company. This represents a failure of leadership that will be addressed through appropriate channels. Harrison's career had just ended, and everyone in the room knew it. Captain Bennett, the general continued, you will be promoted to Major and assigned as the new S3 Operations Officer for the 75th Ranger Regiment. Your first assignment will be developing training protocols to ensure that future operations benefit from the tactical expertise you demonstrated last night. Morgan felt the room spinning around her. In the space of 8 hours, she had gone from disgraced logistics officer to decorated combat leader, from administrative exile to one of the most important operational positions in the Army's Primer Special Operations Unit. General, I'm honored by your confidence, but I want to ensure that the soldiers of Alpha Company receive appropriate recognition for their actions last night. Major Bennett, Alpha Company's courage and professionalism under impossible circumstances will be appropriately recognized. Lieutenant Carter is being recommended for the Silver Star. Staff Sergeant Williams and Sergeant Rodriguez are being recommended for Bronze Stars, and the entire company will receive unit citations for their actions. As the meeting concluded, Morgan walked out of the conference room with Rodriguez, both women still processing the magnitude of what had occurred. "Ma'am, sorry, Major, what happens now?" Morgan looked out the window at Fort Braxton, where soldiers were conducting training that would prepare them for the same impossible situations that Alpha Company had faced. For 18 months she had been separated from that mission, relegated to administrative duties by officers who valued compliance over competence. "Now, Rodriguez, we get back to work. We train soldiers, we develop tactics, and we make sure that no American unit ever again walks into an ambush because their leaders were too proud to listen to good intelligence." 6 months later, the tactical innovations that Major Morgan Bennett developed based on the Alpha Company engagement had been adopted throughout the U.S. Special Operations community. Her manual on small unit operations against superior forces became required reading at the Command and General Staff College, and her training protocols were credited with saving lives in combat zones around the world. But for Morgan, the most satisfying moment came when Lieutenant Carter, now Captain Carter, stopped by her office to report that Alpha Company had completed another successful mission using the tactical principles she had taught them. "Major, the soldiers wanted me to tell you something. They don't call it Alpha Company anymore. They call themselves Bennett's Rangers." Morgan felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized that the soldiers she had saved had chosen to honor her by carrying her name into combat. After years of being told she wasn't fit to lead, she had become the namesake of some of the finest soldiers in the American military. "Captain Carter, tell the Rangers that the honor is entirely mine." Outside her office window, she could see soldiers training for missions that would test their courage, their skill, and their dedication to protecting each other. Thanks to the lessons learned during one impossible night, they would be ready for whatever challenges awaited them. Major Morgan Bennett had finally found her place in the military, training the next generation of soldiers to be worthy of the sacrifices made by those who came before them. She had proven that leadership wasn't about rank or position, it was about being willing to risk everything to protect the soldiers who trusted you with their lives. And she would never have to prove it again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.